I stood frozen in the grand library of Ravenscroft Manor, watching my brother Victor triumphantly raise his glass while our parents announced they were transferring our 200-year-old family estate to him. To the continued legacy of Ravenscroft under Victor's stewardship, my father proclaimed proudly. What none of them realized was that my grandmother had secretly established an irrevocable trust 15 years ago, naming me as the sole trustee, with complete legal authority over the entire property, and I had been quietly saving the estate from financial ruin for the past decade, while they lived beyond their means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to my parents' special family gathering arrived via email on a Tuesday morning, as I was reviewing acquisition proposals for the museum where I served as Director of Historical Preservation. Eleanor, please join us this Sunday. At Ravenscroft, your father and I have important news to share. Victor and Sophia will be attending as well. My mother's message gave no indication that this supposedly joyous family announcement would be the culmination of years of favoritism. Toward my younger brother, I had no reason to suspect anything unusual about this gathering. These family dinners at Ravenscroft had been a monthly occurrence since I moved to the city 10 years ago, though they had grown increasingly strained as the divide between how my parents treated Victor and me widened into an unbridgeable chasm. While I had built a respected career in historical preservation, ironically specializing in maintaining historic estates much like our family home, Victor had followed our father into investment banking, a path my parents considered infinitely more prestigious than my hobby with old buildings, as my father often dismissively described my profession. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculately maintained grounds as I drove through the wrought iron gates of Ravenscroft Manor. I navigated the winding gravel driveway lined with ancient elm trees, each one cataloged in the property's historical registry that I had personally updated 5 years ago. The magnificent Georgian mansion appeared on the horizon, its limestone facade glowing amber in the fading light, exactly as it had stood since 1824 when my ancestor Jonathan Ravenscroft built it after making his fortune in shipping. I parked my modest sedan beside Victor's gleaming Maserati, another extravagant gift from our parents, and gathered the bottle of vintage port I'd brought from my collection. As a final touch, I retrieved the leather portfolio containing the quarterly trust reports from my grandmother's lawyer. I had reviewed them just yesterday, confirming that my latest fund transfer had successfully covered this year's property taxes, which had nearly doubled in the past 5 years as the surrounding area became increasingly desirable. For 10 years, I had been quietly transferring money from my own accounts to cover Ravenscroft's mounting maintenance costs, property taxes, and staff salaries. My grandmother Margaret Ravenscroft had established a trust before her death, naming me as trustee when I turned 25. She had always seen something in me that my parents couldn't, a deep connection to our family's heritage and a responsibility to preserve it. Grandmother had known somehow that my parents' financial situation wasn't as solid as they projected. Bad investments and increasingly lavish lifestyle had begun to drain the family resources even before her death. The trust had been her way of ensuring Ravenscroft's survival while giving me a connection to our legacy that no one could sever. No one in the family knew about the arrangement except for Harriet Winters, our family's longtime estate attorney who had helped grandmother establish the trust. For a decade, I had kept the secret, watching as my parents continued to deplete resources while I quietly shored up the estate's financial foundation. I lived modestly, took few vacations, and limited my own expenses to ensure Ravenscroft remained solvent. I used my key to enter through the side door. Despite everything, I was still a Ravenscroft, and this was still, in some sense, my home. The familiar scent of lemon polish and wood smoke enveloped me as I stepped into the entrance hall. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper whose salary I had been paying for 8 years without anyone's knowledge, greeted me with a warm smile. "Miss Eleanor, they're waiting for you in the library," she said, taking my coat. There was something in her expression, a knowing look that made me wonder if she somehow suspected the truth about the estate's finances. I made my way through the familiar corridors, running my fingers along the oak wainscoting that I had personally arranged to have restored 3 years earlier after water damage threatened its integrity, another expense paid through the trust. The murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses grew louder as I approached the library, my grandmother's favorite room and the heart of Ravenscroft's historical significance. I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. My parents stood, near the massive stone fireplace, my father distinguished in his tailored suit, silver hair perfectly groomed, every inch the successful banker even in retirement. My mother beside him, elegant as always in designer attire that cost more than most people earned in a month. Victor and his wife Sophia were seated on the leather Chesterfield sofa that I had reupholstered last year, champagne flutes in hand. A collection of legal documents was spread across the antique rosewood coffee table, documents I immediately recognized as property transfer papers. "Eleanor, finally!" my mother called out, moving to embrace me. "We were beginning to think you'd be late for your own brother's big moment." "Traffic on the parkway," I explained, accepting her perfunctory kiss on my cheek. "What's the occasion?" Victor's smile was triumphant as he stood to greet me. At 32, 2 years my junior, he had always possessed the confident air of someone who expected the world to accommodate his desires. "You're just in time for the announcement, Ellie," he said, using the childhood nickname I had long outgrown, but he persisted in using. My father cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention as he had throughout my childhood with that simple gesture. "Eleanor, your mother and I have been discussing the future of Ravenscroft for some time now," he began, his tone measured and authoritative. "As you know, properties like this require significant resources and dedicated management to maintain their legacy." I nodded, the irony of his statement nearly causing me to laugh aloud. If only he knew how intimately familiar I was with exactly what resources Ravenscroft required, and who had been providing them for the past decade. With Victor's financial acumen and his plans to start a family with Sophia, my mother continued, beaming at my brother and his wife, "we've decided it's time to secure Ravenscroft's future for the next generation." My father picked up one of the documents from the coffee table. "We're transferring ownership of Ravenscroft to Victor and Sophia. The paperwork is nearly complete. We'll sign everything next week after our attorney reviews the final details." The world seemed to tilt beneath me as the full implication of his words registered. They were giving away Ravenscroft, my birthright, the estate I had secretly been helping to maintain financially for the past decade, without so much as a conversation with me. The property they thought was theirs to give had been secretly protected by my grandmother's foresight. I don't understand," I managed, my voice steadier than I expected. "Why now? And why wasn't I consulted about this decision?" My father frowned, the expression I had seen countless times when I questioned his authority. "Eleanor, be reasonable. Victor is starting a family. He's successfully managing the family's investments, and frankly, he's in a financial position to maintain an estate of this magnitude. What would you do with a place like this on a museum curator's salary?" Victor leaned forward, his expression a mixture of condescension and false sympathy. "Come on, Ellie. You live in that apartment downtown surrounded by your books and artifacts. This place needs someone who can actually afford to maintain it properly." The irony of his statement might have been amusing if it weren't so painful. If they only knew that his extravagant lifestyle, the Maserati, the vacation home in the Hamptons, the private club memberships, had been possible because I had been quietly covering Ravenscroft's expenses, allowing my parents to continue funding his pursuits while believing their own financial situation was secure. I looked around the library, at the restored ceiling medallions I had commissioned, the carefully preserved first edition books in the glass-fronted cases, the original hardwood, floors I had saved from water damage after a pipe burst 2 winters ago. Every corner of this room, every inch of Ravenscroft, carried my invisible fingerprints alongside the legacy of generations of Ravenscrofts who had come before us. I had a choice to make. I could reveal my grandmother's trust immediately, shattering their celebratory mood and exposing years of financial mismanagement. Or I could remain silent, gathering more information about their plans while consulting with Harriet about the most strategic way to assert my legal rights to the property. "I see," I said finally, setting my portfolio beside me on a side table. "And the decision is final?" "We thought you'd be happy for your brother," my mother said, her expression a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "This is about securing the Ravenscroft legacy." I looked around the table at my father's stern certainty, my mother's practiced elegance, Victor's poorly concealed triumph, and Sophia's calculating gaze. None of them knew that what they were attempting was legally impossible without my consent. The property they thought was theirs to give had been secretly protected by my grandmother's foresight. "May I see the paperwork?" I asked, my decision still unformed. Victor hesitated before sliding the folder across the table. "It's all standard transfer documentation," he said with affected nonchalance. "Dad's firm handled everything." I opened the folder, scanning the legal language I had become intimately familiar with through my years managing the trust. The documents named my parents as the full owners of Ravenscroft Manor, transferring all rights and responsibilities to Victor and Sophia Ravenscroft, with no mention of the Margaret Ravenscroft Trust that actually held the property's title. "Did Harriet Winters review these documents?" I asked, knowing she hadn't. Harriet would have been legally obligated to disclose the trust's existence. "Harriet is practically retired," my father dismissed with a wave. "Daniel Green at the firm handled everything. Why does it matter?" I closed the folder, buying time as I considered my next move. The truth would shatter my family's perception of the past decade. It would expose my parents' financial mismanagement and force them to acknowledge how they had overlooked and undervalued me while I saved the very legacy they now wanted to hand to Victor. "No reason," I said finally, forcing a smile that felt brittle on my face. "I was just curious about the details." My mother beamed, misinterpreting my response as acceptance. "Wonderful. We'll have a proper celebration once everything is finalized. Perhaps a housewarming party for Victor and Sophia as the new stewards of Ravenscroft." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the conversation shifted to renovation plans, Sophia was apparently keen to modernize the historically significant East Wing. I found myself studying each family member with new eyes, seeing clearly the patterns that had shaped our relationships since childhood. My relationship with Ravenscroft had begun long before my grandmother's trust made it official. From my earliest memories, I had been drawn to the estate's history, spending countless hours exploring its rooms, grounds, and artifacts, while Victor remained indifferent to our heritage. At 8 years old, I had created my first catalog of the library's first editions. By 12, I could recite the provenance of every portrait in the Grand Gallery. At 16, I had written a research paper on Ravenscroft's architectural significance that won a national history competition. My grandmother Margaret had nurtured this passion, recognizing in me the same deep appreciation for preservation and continuity that had guided her own life. "Buildings like Ravenscroft aren't merely structures. Eleanor," she would say during our afternoon teas in the conservatory, "they're repositories of human stories, vessels that carry our collective memory forward. To preserve them properly is to honor not just bricks and mortar, but the human spirit itself." While my parents dismissed my historical interests as impractical, Margaret recognized them as essential. She had watched with growing concern as my father's investment strategies became increasingly risky, and my mother's spending habits more extravagant. When I turned 20, a year before her death, she had taken me aside during my college break. Eleanor, she had said, her voice strong despite her failing health. I fear for Ravenscroft's future. Your parents don't understand what truly sustains a legacy. It isn't money or social position, but dedicated stewardship and genuine appreciation. She had squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Promise me you'll watch over this place when I'm gone. It needs someone who sees its true value. At the time, I hadn't understood the full weight of what she was asking. I assumed her concern was sentimental rather than financial. It wasn't until after her death, when Harriet Winters contacted me on my 25th birthday, that I learned the truth. Grandmother had legally ensured I would have the means to fulfill my promise. The trust documentation had shocked me, not just the legal control it granted me, but the accompanying letter explaining why she had arranged it secretly. Your father would see this as a lack of faith in his financial abilities, she had written. Perhaps it is. But I have absolute faith in your commitment to preserving what matters. The secrecy protects both the estate and your relationship with your family. Reveal the trust only when absolutely necessary. For 10 years, I had honored that request for secrecy, watching as my brother received increasingly generous loans and gifts from our parents while I built my career in historical preservation, living modestly while quietly directing a significant portion of my income toward Ravenscroft's mounting expenses. The first year had been the most difficult, as I learned to navigate the complex financial responsibilities of maintaining a historic estate. Property taxes alone consumed most of my disposable income. When the boiler system failed the following winter, I had been forced to liquidate some personal investments to cover the replacement costs. By the third year, I had developed a systematic approach, working with Harriet to establish a quarterly transfer schedule and prioritization system for maintenance projects. I had cultivated relationships with restoration specialists who would work within my constrained budget, often accepting delayed payment schedules when emergencies arose. All the while, I watched my parents continue to deplete their resources, maintaining the illusion of prosperity while the actual financial foundation of Ravenscroft rested increasingly on my shoulders. Victor's career in investment banking flourished under our father's mentorship and connections, his rapid promotions and bonuses celebrated at family gatherings, while my professional achievements in preservation received polite but dismissive acknowledgement. It's lovely that you enjoy your work, Eleanor, my mother would say, the faint emphasis on enjoy making it clear she considered my career a pleasant diversion rather than a serious profession. Though I still think you could have done so well in art appraisal. The connections would have been so much more substantial. What my mother never grasped was that my career choice wasn't about social connections or prestige. It was about developing the exact expertise needed to protect and maintain properties like Ravenscroft. Every restoration project I supervised, every preservation grant I secured for the museum, every historical designation I helped establish for endangered properties strengthened my ability to serve as Ravenscroft's guardian. 6 years into my secret stewardship, a severe storm had damaged the West Wing roof, threatening priceless architectural details and the historical furniture beneath it. The estimate for proper historical restoration came to nearly $150,000, far more than I could manage from my salary alone. I had been forced to sell the small apartment I had purchased and move to a rental, using the proceeds to save Ravenscroft's Western exposure, while telling my family I'd decided home ownership was too restricting for my lifestyle. Victor had smirked at this explanation during a family dinner. Classic Ellie, always taking the unconventional path. Some of us prefer building equity rather than throwing money away on rent. The irony of his statement, as he literally sat beneath a roof I had sacrificed my own equity to restore, had required every ounce of my self-control to withstand without comment. Throughout these years, only Harriet Winters knew the full extent of my financial commitment to Ravenscroft. Every quarter, she would review the trust accounts with me. her expression growing increasingly troubled as the gap between my contributions and my parents' awareness of the estate's true financial situation widened. "Eleanor," she had said during our most recent meeting just 3 weeks ago, "this arrangement was never meant to place such burden on you alone. Your grandmother anticipated you would need to guide your parents toward financial reality, not indefinitely shield them from it. Revealing the trust would destroy my relationship with them," I had argued, though with less conviction than in previous years. "They would see it as a betrayal, both grandmothers and mine." Harriet had fixed me with the penetrating gaze that had likely served her well through decades of legal practice. And allowing them to give away property they don't actually own wouldn't be destructive? "The truth will emerge eventually, Eleanor. The only question is whether you control that revelation or circumstances force it upon all of you." Now, watching Victor and Sophia eagerly discuss their renovation plans for a property they would never legally possess, I recognized the inevitability Harriet had been warning me about. The comfortable fiction I had maintained for a decade was reaching its natural conclusion. The East Wing could be completely modernized, Sophia was saying, her interior designer's enthusiasm evident as she gestured expansively. "We're thinking of converting the morning room into a home gym and media center." My stomach tightened at the thought of the historically significant Adams-style moldings and original Georgian windows being sacrificed for workout equipment and television screens. The morning room's architectural details had been personally commissioned by Jonathan Ravenscroft in 1824, inspired by his travels through Europe. Its historical significance extended far beyond our family's personal attachment. "The morning room is part of Ravenscroft's original architectural footprint," I said, unable to remain silent. "Its features are documented in the National Registry of Historic Places. Any significant alterations would require approval from the Preservation Board." Victor rolled his eyes. "There you go again with the historical preservation lecture. Once we own the place, we can update it to actually function for modern living." "It's not that simple," I countered, professional knowledge momentarily overriding my decision to proceed cautiously. "Ravenscroft's historical designation comes with legal protections and restrictions. Violating them could result in significant penalties and even forced restoration." My father frowned. "Eleanor, I appreciate your professional expertise, but Victor and Sophia will be the owners. They'll need to balance preservation considerations with making Ravenscroft their home." The conversation continued in this vein through dinner, with my brother and his wife outlining increasingly alarming modification plans, while my parents offered enthusiastic support. Each proposed change demonstrated their fundamental misunderstanding of both Ravenscroft's historical significance and the legal framework protecting it, regardless of who held the deed. As coffee was served in the drawing room, I excused myself, claiming an early meeting the following day. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed down on me as I gathered my coat and portfolio. "You'll come to the signing next week, won't you, Eleanor?" my mother asked as she walked me to the door. "It would mean so much to have you there for this family milestone." I looked into her expectant face, seeing genuine hope for family harmony alongside complete unawareness of the legal impossibility of what they were planning. "I'll be there," I promised, knowing that the truth about Ravenscroft would emerge, one way or another by then. The only question remaining was whether I would control that revelation or allow it to unfold through legal intervention. As I drove away from Ravenscroft that evening, watching the grand old house recede in my rearview mirror, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, I knew that whatever choice I made would permanently alter my relationship with my family. The question wasn't whether I would fight for my birthright, but how and when I would make my stand. Monday morning arrived with pristine clarity, as if the universe itself was providing optimal conditions for clear thinking. I arrived at the ID Westbrook Museum of Historical Arts an hour earlier than usual, needing the sanctuary of my office to process yesterday's revelations and plan my next steps. As director of preservation, I had my own space, a modest but elegant office overlooking the museum's Victorian courtyard, its walls lined with architectural drawings and preservation maps that represented my life's work. I closed my door, set down my coffee, and pulled out my phone. It was time to call Harriet Winters. After 3 rings, her distinctive voice answered, carrying that unique blend of warmth and authority that had guided our family through legal matters for over 4 decades. Eleanor Ravenscroft, I was expecting your call after yesterday's gathering, she said without preamble. They're transferring Ravenscroft to Victor, I replied, the reality still striking me as absurd despite having witnessed it firsthand. The paperwork is being finalized for signing next week. I see. Her tone conveyed volumes of understanding. And you didn't reveal the trust's existence? Not yet. I needed to consult with you first about the most strategic approach. I paused, organizing my thoughts. They've engaged Daniel Green from my father's old firm to handle the transfer. He obviously hasn't discovered the trust yet during the title search. He wouldn't, Harriet confirmed. The title is registered under the Margaret Ravenscroft Historical Preservation Trust, rather than individual names. Unless someone specifically looked for trust attachments to the property, it wouldn't immediately appear in a standard ownership search. I sighed, recognizing the legal complexity that now faced us. How much time do we have before the transfer process encounters the trust? Given your father's connections and Daniel's efficiency, I'd estimate a week at most before they conduct the comprehensive title examination that would reveal the trust's existence. This timeline aligned with my parents' mentioned signing date, creating a narrow window for me to decide how to proceed. What are my options, Harriet? You have several, none particularly pleasant, she began, her tone measured. You could reveal the trust immediately, which would certainly halt the transfer but create considerable family discord. You could wait until the transfer process encounters the trust, at which point Daniel will be legally obligated to disclose its existence. She paused meaningfully. Or you could choose to dissolve the trust and allow the transfer to proceed. Dissolve it? I sat up straighter. After everything I've done to maintain Ravenscroft? It is an option, Harriet acknowledged. Though, not one I would recommend. Margaret was explicit about her wishes. She wanted Ravenscroft preserved for future generations under your stewardship. I thought about the countless nights I'd stayed up reviewing the estate's finances, the vacations I'd skipped to afford property tax payments, the careful budgeting that allowed me to divert nearly a third of my salary to Ravenscroft's upkeep. I thought about Victor's Maserati and my mother's designer wardrobe, luxuries they enjoyed while I secretly kept our family legacy from financial collapse. They'll be humiliated when they learn the truth, I said quietly. Perhaps, Harriet, aloud. Or perhaps they'll finally recognize the tremendous service you've been providing all these years. We both knew which outcome was more likely. My father's pride had been the driving force in our family dynamics for as long as I could remember. Learning that his mother had circumvented his authority by establishing the trust, and that I had kept it secret for a decade, would strike at the very foundation of his self-image. There's one more thing to consider, Harriet added, her voice taking on a more formal quality. The final stipulation in Margaret's trust. What stipulation? I asked, certain I had reviewed all the trust documentation thoroughly over the years. This was to be given to you when either the trust was revealed to the family or on your 40th birthday, whichever came first, Harriet explained. I've kept it in my private safe since Margaret entrusted it to me 15 years ago. My curiosity was immediately piqued. What is it? A letter, handwritten by your grandmother the week before she died. She asked that I deliver it to you personally. I'd like to meet with you today, if possible. We arranged to meet for lunch at the Wellington, a private club in the financial district where Harriet conducted most of her confidential business meetings. The exclusivity and discretion of the establishment made it perfect for discussions of sensitive family matters. I spent the morning in a state of heightened focus, channeling my nervous energy into finalizing exhibition details for our upcoming showcase on endangered architectural treasures. Each property in the exhibition represented a preservation battle, some won, some lost, all instructive about what happens when historical significance collides with commercial interests or neglect. The parallels to Ravenscroft's current situation weren't lost on me. My assistant Marcus noticed my distraction but knew better than to pry. "The Architectural Heritage Foundation called about your presentation next month," he mentioned as he placed a stack of acquisition proposals on my desk. "They want to know if you'll be addressing the tax implications of historical designations in private residences." "Tell them yes," I replied, the irony of the topic hitting home. "I'll be covering the financial responsibilities and benefits in detail." By noon, I was in a taxi heading downtown, my mind racing with questions about my grandmother's letter and the approaching confrontation with my family. The Wellington Club hadn't changed in the decades I'd been coming here, first with my grandmother, for occasional lunches, later with Harriet for trust matters. Dark mahogany paneling, oil portraits of distinguished members, and leather chairs that had witnessed generations of confidential conversations created an atmosphere where time seemed to stand still. A uniformed attendant escorted me to Harriet's usual corner table where she was already waiting, a manila envelope placed precisely before her like a chess-opening move. "Eleanor?" She stood as I approached, taking my hand in hers. Her grip remained firm despite her 76 years. "You look troubled, my dear." "I have reason to be," I replied, sliding into the chair across from her. "My family is about to discover I've been living a double life for a decade." Harriet's expression softened with understanding. She had witnessed our family dynamics since before I was born, serving first as my grandfather's attorney, then my grandmother's confidant, and now my legal guide through the complexities of the trust. Her perspective spanned generations of Ravenscroft history. "Before we discuss strategy," she said, pushing the envelope toward me, "you should read your grandmother's letter. It may provide context for the decisions you now face." With slightly trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of heavy stationery covered in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, either our family has discovered your role as trustee of Ravenscroft, or you've reached your 40th birthday with the trust still intact. Either way, the time has come for you to know the complete truth. Ravenscroft has always been more than a family home. It represents our history, our values, and our responsibility to preserve something meaningful for future generations. I chose you as trustee not simply because I recognized your love for our heritage, but because I saw in you a strength of character that our family desperately needs. Your father and brother possess many admirable qualities, but they lack the vision to see beyond immediate gratification. This isn't entirely their fault. Our privilege has shielded them from developing the wisdom that comes from genuine struggle and sacrifice. The final provision of the trust, which Harriet will explain in legal terms, gives you complete authority to determine Ravenscroft's ultimate fate. You may maintain it within the trust, transfer it to family members of your choosing, or convert it to a historical foundation that ensures its preservation in perpetuity. Whatever you decide, know that my faith in you has never wavered. Your compassion, integrity, and quiet determination will guide you to the right choice, not just for the property, but for our family's true legacy. With love and complete confidence, Grandmother Margaret. I looked up from the letter to find Harriet watching me with a gentle expression. "She knew this day would come," I said, carefully refolding the letter. "Margaret was many things, but never naive about human nature," Harriet agreed. "The trust gives you complete legal authority over Ravenscroft. Your parents' attempt to transfer the property will inevitably fail once the title search reveals the trust's existence." How long do I have before that happens? Given the complexity of the estate and your father's notorious impatience with details, I'd estimate 1 week at most before Daniel discovers the obstacle. 1 week to decide how to handle a revelation that would permanently alter my family dynamics. 1 week to determine whether to assert my legal rights or find another solution that might preserve some semblance of family harmony. Thank you, Harriet, I said, tucking my grandmother's letter into my purse. I need time to think. Of course, she signaled for the check. But Eleanor, remember one thing. Margaret didn't create this trust merely to preserve a building. She did it to preserve values she saw in you that she feared were fading from the rest of the family. Whatever you decide about Ravenscroft, don't lose sight of what your grandmother was truly trying to protect. As I left the Wellington and walked into the bright afternoon sunlight, my phone chimed with a text from Victor. Mom wants to know if you're free for dinner Thursday to discuss color schemes for the main hall. Sophia has some ideas. The audacity was so typical of my family that I almost laughed. They were already planning changes to a property they didn't legally own, inviting me to witness my own displacement from the home I had secretly maintained for years. I didn't respond immediately, instead changing direction and heading toward Westbrook Park. I needed space to think, away from both museum responsibilities and family expectations. Finding a bench near the central fountain, I sat and gathered my thoughts. For 10 years, I had silently shouldered the burden of preserving Ravenscroft, finding a strange satisfaction in being the secret guardian of my family's legacy. There had been a certain power in knowing something my parents and brother didn't. That without my intervention, the estate they took for granted would have been lost years ago. But that secret had also kept me locked in a pattern of martyrdom and resentment. I had enabled my family's illusions about their financial security, while quietly seething at their lack of appreciation for my sacrifices. Perhaps my grandmother had foreseen this too, that the secrecy she initially mandated would eventually become unsustainable, forcing a reckoning that would either break our family apart or forge a more honest relationship among us. As the afternoon light began to fade, I finally answered Victor's text. I'll be there. We have a lot to discuss about Ravenscroft's future. Whatever path I chose, the days of silence and secret-keeping were coming to an end. The truth about Ravenscroft and my role in its preservation would soon emerge. The only question remaining was whether I would control that revelation or allow it to control me. Thursday evening arrived with ominous gray clouds hanging over the city, matching my mood as I drove toward Ravenscroft. I had spent the intervening days oscillating between righteous anger and reluctant compassion, between revealing everything immediately and finding a more measured approach that might preserve some family harmony. My grandmother's letter remained in my purse, its presence, a constant reminder of the responsibility she had entrusted to me, not just for the property but for the values it represented. As I turned onto the estate's long driveway, I noticed additional cars parked near the entrance. A silver Mercedes I recognized as belonging to Sophia's parents, the Blackwells, and a black BMW that likely belonged to Daniel Green, the attorney, handling the property transfer. This wasn't just a family dinner to discuss color schemes. They were moving forward aggressively with their plans. I parked beside the carriage house rather than in the main circular drive, a small act of rebellion. This had been my parking spot throughout high school and college, the place where my first car, a used Volvo gifted by my grandmother on my 16th birthday, had always sat. Victor's vehicles had always occupied the prime position near the front entrance, another subtle reinforcement of the family hierarchy. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I approached the house, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. I hadn't bothered bringing an umbrella, and by the time I reached the front door, my hair was damp and my carefully selected outfit, a navy blue suit that projected both confidence and professionalism, was speckled with raindrops. The door, opened before I could use my key, revealing Sophia in a cream-colored ensemble that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor," she said with practiced hospitality. "Everyone's in the drawing room. Would you like a towel for your hair?" "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, stepping past her into the foyer. The familiar scent of beeswax polish and fresh flowers greeted me, the work of Mrs. Caldwell, whose salary I had been paying for 8 years without anyone's knowledge. Voices drifted from the drawing room, my father's authoritative tone, my mother's social laugh, the deeper rumble of unfamiliar male voices. I straightened my shoulders, touched the outline of my grandmother's letter in my purse for reassurance, and walked toward the sound. The drawing room at Ravenscroft was designed to impress, with its soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and antique furnishings that had been in the family for generations. I had personally arranged for the restoration of the original William Morris wallpaper 2 years earlier, a painstaking process that had cost nearly $45,000, all from my personal funds through the trust. 6 people turned to look at me as I entered. My parents, Victor and Sophia, an older couple I recognized as the Blackwells, and a young man in his early 30s wearing an expensive suit that screamed corporate law. "Eleanor, finally," my mother said, rising to greet me. "You remember Richard and Diana Blackwell, Sophia's parents, and this is Daniel Green from your father's old firm. He's handling the Ravenscroft transfer." I shook hands with each of them, noting Daniel's firm grip and assessing gaze. He was exactly the type my father favored. Ambitious, polished, and utterly convinced of his own competence. "Sorry, I'm a bit damp," I said, taking the only remaining seat. A straight-backed chair slightly removed from the intimate grouping of sofas where everyone else sat. "I got caught in the rain. We were just discussing the timeline for finalizing the transfer," my father explained, his tone making it clear that my tardiness had delayed important business. "Daniel believes we can complete everything by next Wednesday." Next Wednesday? My conversation with Harriet had suggested we had a week before the trust was discovered, but it seemed my father's influence was accelerating the process. That's faster than I expected. Daniel smiled confidently. "We've expedited the title search and preliminary paperwork. Barring any unforeseen complications, the property will be officially transferred to Victor and Sophia by the end of next week." The irony of his statement, "barring any unforeseen complications," nearly made me laugh. The Margaret Ravenscroft Trust was exactly the type of complication that would bring their entire plan crashing down. "And then we can begin the renovations," Sophia added excitedly. "We're thinking of converting the library into a modern entertainment space, home theater, gaming area, expanded wet bar." I nearly choked on the water I was sipping. The library? My grandmother's sanctuary, with its irreplaceable first editions and custom-built Edwardian bookcases, the historical heart of Ravenscroft. "The library is one of the most historically significant rooms in the house," I said, unable to keep the shock from my voice. "The bookcases were designed by Edwin Lutyens in 1911 specifically for that space. We'll preserve the books, of course," my mother interjected soothingly. "They can be relocated to the morning room." "It's not just about the books," I tried to explain. "The architectural integrity of the space, the proportions, the millwork, the relationship between the built-in elements and the room dimensions, they're all part of what makes Ravenscroft historically important." Victor rolled his eyes. "There she goes again. Eleanor, not everyone wants to live in a museum. Ravenscroft needs to function for modern living." Daniel Green studied me with newfound interest. "You seem quite knowledgeable about the property's historical elements, Miss Ravenscroft." "Eleanor is our family historian," my father said with the dismissive affection he always used when describing my preservation career. "She works at the Westbrook Museum, preserving old buildings and artifacts." "I'm the director of historical preservation," I corrected, specializing in architectural conservation of significant historic estates. I turned to Daniel directly. Actually, Ravenscroft is listed in the National Registry of Historic Places, which places certain restrictions on structural modifications to maintain its historical designation. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. Professional interest peaked. I wasn't aware of that designation. It's not mentioned in the property documentation I've reviewed. The designation was updated 5 years ago, I explained, knowing exactly why it wasn't in his documentation. I had arranged the updated designation through the trust, another layer of protection for Ravenscroft that my parents had either ignored or remained oblivious to. It provides tax benefits but requires adherence to preservation guidelines for any renovations. My father frowned. That can't be right. I would have been notified about any change in the property's status. I met his gaze steadily. The notifications would have gone to the property's legal representative. Which is me, my father stated firmly. I held my tongue, knowing that the notifications had actually gone to Harriet as the trust's legal representative. This was the moment I could have revealed everything, explained about the trust, my role as trustee, and the decade of financial support I had provided. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone sensed the unspoken conflict beneath our exchange. But looking at my father's confident expression, my mother's hopeful face, and Victor's proprietary posture, I realized this wasn't the right setting for such a revelation. The presence of the Blackwells and Daniel Green would make the disclosure even more humiliating for my family. Whatever my frustrations with them, public embarrassment wouldn't serve any constructive purpose. Perhaps there's been some administrative confusion, I conceded, temporarily retreating from confrontation. It might be worth verifying the designation before proceeding with significant renovations. Daniel made a note in his portfolio. I'll look into the registry status as part of our due diligence. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. The conversation moved on to other aspects of the transfer: timelines, legal requirements, the financial arrangements Victor and Sophia had made to purchase the property from our parents for a nominal sum that would allow them to remain living in the West Wing while transferring ownership. Throughout the discussion, I remained largely silent, absorbing the details of their plans while recognizing their legal impossibility. What struck me most was how thoroughly they had planned my exclusion from Ravenscroft's future. There was talk of guest rooms being maintained for family visits, but it was clear that in their vision, I would become an occasional visitor to my own home, the home I had sacrificed so much to preserve. Of course, Eleanor will always have access to the family archives for her historical research, Victor said magnanimously, as if granting me a great favor. How generous, I replied, unable to keep a hint of irony from my voice. Daniel studied me with increased scrutiny, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite interpret. As the meeting concluded and we moved toward the dining room for dinner, he fell into step beside me. Miss Ravenscroft, he began. Eleanor, please. Eleanor. He corrected himself. Your knowledge of the property is impressive. Have you been involved in its maintenance over the years? This was my opening, a perfect opportunity to hint at my actual role without creating a scene. You could say I've taken a special interest in Ravenscroft's preservation, I replied, carefully. Historical estates require dedicated attention to maintain their integrity. Indeed, he agreed, his tone suggesting he was reassessing something about the situation. If you don't mind my asking, how do you feel about the property transfer to your brother? I paused, considering my response. I believe that whoever takes responsibility for Ravenscroft should understand both its historical significance and the financial realities of maintaining it properly. Financial realities? He echoed, his legal mind clearly detecting the implication. The property assessment indicates it's in excellent condition, with all systems and structures well maintained. That level of upkeep represents significant investment. Yes, I said simply, letting the word hang between us. It certainly does. A flash of understanding crossed his features before he masked it with professional neutrality. I see. Perhaps. We should discuss this further after dinner. Dinner proceeded with excruciating slowness. Course after course emerged from the kitchen as my parents, the Blackwells and Victor and Sophia, discussed Ravenscroft's future as if it were already decided. They talked about renovations to the East Wing, modernizing the library, expanding the master suite, and potentially adding a pool house near the formal gardens. Of course, we'll preserve the historical character, Victor assured everyone, as if this demonstrated his great respect for heritage. The exterior will remain untouched. It's mainly the interior spaces that need updating. I pushed my food around my plate, remembering the painstaking work I had commissioned 3 years earlier to restore the original ceiling medallions throughout the house, another expense I had covered through the trust. Eleanor restored the drawing room ceiling, my mother mentioned unexpectedly, causing me to look up in surprise. She found old photographs showing the original paint design and had it recreated. It was quite impressive. This acknowledgement of my contribution, however small, was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't respond. I didn't know you had an interest in restoration projects, Sophia said, her tone suggesting she found this odd. There's a lot about me this family doesn't know, I replied, the words escaping before I could reconsider. A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Well, my father said briskly, the drawing room ceiling is beautiful, and we appreciate your contribution, Eleanor. I'm sure Victor and Sophia will maintain all the historical elements you've helped restore. The conversation moved on, but I noticed Daniel watching me with increased interest, as if reassessing something about my role in the family dynamics. As coffee and dessert were served, the discussion turned to practical matters of the transfer, paperwork to be signed, legalities to be addressed, timelines to be confirmed. My presence seemed almost forgotten until Daniel turned to me directly. Eleanor, as a family member, you'll need to sign a quitclaim deed as well, just to ensure a clean title. I can have that sent to your office tomorrow. A quitclaim deed would require me to relinquish any potential claim to Ravenscroft, an impossibility given the trust. I'll review it when it arrives, I said noncommittally. The evening finally wound down with the Blackwells departing first, followed by Daniel, who shook my hand with particular interest before leaving. I look forward to working with you on finalizing this transfer, he said meaningfully. Family properties can be complicated. His emphasis on complicated made me wonder if he suspected something already. Perhaps the title search was further along than he had indicated at dinner. As I prepared to leave, Victor cornered me near the front door. You were awfully quiet tonight, Ellie. Is something bothering you? For a brief moment, I considered unburdening myself, telling my brother everything about the trust, the decade of financial support I had provided, the truth about Ravenscroft's ownership. But the triumphant gleam in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't the right moment for revelations. Just tired, I lied. It's been a busy week at the museum. Well, Sophia and I appreciate you being supportive about the transfer, he said, clearly interpreting my silence as acquiescence. Once everything's settled, you'll always have a place here. This will still be your family home, too. The condescension in his offer, granting me access to a home that was legally mine through the trust, was almost too much to bear. How generous of you, I managed, reaching for the door handle. I should go. It's getting late. As I drove away from Ravenscroft that night, the rain had stopped and glimpses of stars appeared between breaking clouds. The universe, it seemed, was offering a metaphor for my situation, clarity emerging after storm and darkness. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made my decision. Tomorrow morning, I would contact Harriet Winters and set events in motion. That would forever change my family's understanding of Ravenscroft and of me. Friday morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that often follows stormy weather. I woke before my alarm. The weight that had pressed on me for days transformed into purposeful energy. After making my decision the previous evening, I experienced a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes when you finally choose a difficult but necessary path forward. As I prepared for the day, I selected a structured charcoal suit that projected authority and confidence. Every choice felt significant, from my grandmother's vintage pearl earrings to the leather portfolio containing the complete trust documentation that I had retrieved from my home safe that morning. By 7:30, I was at my desk at the Westbrook Museum. The office door closed to signal my need for privacy. I called Harriet Winters, who answered immediately despite the early hour. "I've made my decision," I told her without preamble. "It's time to reveal the trust, but I want to control how and when the information emerges." "I expected as much after our last conversation," Harriet replied, her tone neutral but supportive. "What's your preferred approach?" "Not a confrontation," I said firmly. "I need documentation that clearly establishes the trust's existence and my role as trustee. But I want to present this information strategically, first to Daniel Green, then to my family in a setting where they can process it privately." Harriet's approval was evident in her voice. "A measured approach. Margaret would be proud of your handling of this situation. Can you prepare the necessary documentation today? I'd like to meet with Daniel as soon as possible before he discovers the trust through the title search and informs my family without my involvement." "I'll have everything ready by noon," Harriet assured me. "My office will contact you when the paperwork is prepared." My next call was to Daniel Green himself. His assistant initially tried to schedule me for later in the week, but when I mentioned it concerned the Ravenscroft transfer and potential legal complications, I was connected to Daniel immediately. "Eleanor Ravenscroft," he said, his voice shifting from casual to professional interest. "I was planning to contact you today about the quitclaim deed." "That's partially why I'm calling," I replied. "There are aspects of the Ravenscroft situation that require immediate discussion. I'd like to meet with you today, if possible." A brief pause followed. "Is this something I should be concerned about?" "It's something that will significantly impact the property transfer," I said carefully. "I believe it's in everyone's best interest, including yours professionally, that we discuss this before proceeding further." To his credit, Daniel recognized the seriousness in my tone. "I can meet you at 3 this afternoon. Will that work?" "Perfectly. I'll come to your office." I wanted this conversation to occur on his professional territory, where legal realities would take precedence over family dynamics. With those arrangements made, I turned my attention to my museum responsibilities, focusing on final preparations for our Endangered Architectural Treasures exhibition. The familiar work centered me, a reminder that my identity extended beyond the Ravenscroft family drama. By the time Harriet's office called to inform me that the trust documentation was ready, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't for days. At 2:00, I collected the leather portfolio containing the trust documents from Harriet's office. She had organized everything methodically: the original trust establishment, amendments, financial records showing my contributions over the past decade, and a comprehensive summary of the legal implications. "Remember," Harriet advised as I prepared to leave, "you're not doing this to punish your family, but to establish truth and preserve your grandmother's intentions for Ravenscroft." I nodded, grateful for her perspective. "I'm trying to protect the estate and honor grandmother's wishes. Everything else is secondary." Daniel Green's office was located in a gleaming downtown skyscraper, the headquarters of Blackwell Stern and Associates, my father's old firm where Victor was now a junior partner. I had visited occasionally for family functions, but never on business of my own. As I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, I considered the irony of using my father's own firm to halt his plans. The receptionist directed me to Daniel's corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the city skyline. Daniel rose from behind his desk as I entered, gesturing to a conference table rather than the more subordinate visitor chairs facing his desk. He was acknowledging me as a party with power, not merely a family member being consulted as a courtesy. "Eleanor," he began after we were seated, "you mentioned concerns about the Ravenscroft transfer. I'd like to understand the nature of these concerns before we proceed." I placed Harriet's portfolio on the table between us. "What I'm about to share will significantly alter your understanding of the Ravenscroft situation. Before I open this, I want to make something clear. My intention is not to create problems for my family, but to ensure that legally binding arrangements concerning the estate are properly respected." Daniel's expression remained professional, but I noticed a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. Of course, as the attorney handling this transfer, I have an obligation to ensure everything proceeds legally. I opened the portfolio and removed the trust documentation, sliding it across the table. 15 years ago, my grandmother Margaret Ravenscroft established a trust that holds legal title to Ravenscroft Manor. I have been the sole trustee of this trust since I turned 25. My parents do not actually own Ravenscroft, despite their belief to the contrary. Daniel's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise as he began examining the documents. He flipped through the pages with increasing focus, occasionally glancing up at me with reassessment in his eyes. "This appears to be legitimate and properly executed," he said finally. "But I'm confused. The title search we've begun hasn't flagged this trust. Because the title is registered under the Margaret Ravenscroft Historical Preservation Trust rather than individual names," I explained. "You would have discovered it eventually, but I wanted to bring this to your attention directly, rather than have it emerge during the process." Daniel continued reviewing the documentation, pausing at the financial records. "These show regular payments from your personal accounts toward the estate's expenses. Mortgage, taxes, maintenance costs." He looked up sharply. "Your parents don't know about this?" "No. My grandmother stipulated that the trust remain confidential unless circumstances required disclosure. She was concerned about my parents' financial management and wanted to ensure Ravenscroft's preservation regardless of their decisions." Daniel sat back, absorbing the implications. "So, the transfer your father has instructed me to execute cannot legally proceed without your approval as trustee. My parents cannot transfer property they don't actually own," I finished for him. A complicated mixture of emotions crossed Daniel's face. Professional concern about the failed title search, obvious discomfort at having to deliver this news to my father, and what appeared to be genuine admiration for my direct approach. "This creates a difficult situation for everyone involved," he said carefully. "I understand that, which is why I came to you first rather than simply waiting for the transfer to hit this roadblock," I replied. "I'd like to work together on how best to communicate this to my family." Daniel nodded slowly, professional, respect evident in his expression. "I appreciate that consideration. This could have been much more problematic if discovered later in the process." He paused, considering. "What exactly are you hoping to achieve here, Eleanor? Do you intend to block the transfer permanently?" It was the central question. What did I actually want to happen with Ravenscroft? In the days since discovering my parents' plans, I had been so focused on the injustice of their actions that I hadn't fully articulated my own vision for the estate's future. My primary concern is ensuring that Ravenscroft is preserved according to my grandmother's intentions, I said thoughtfully. The trust gives me legal authority to determine the estate's future, but I'm not opposed to my brother and his family living there, provided they understand and respect the property's historical significance, and the financial realities of maintaining it. In other words, you want recognition of your role and input into how the property is managed going forward, Daniel summarized. Along with acknowledgement of the financial support I've provided for the past decade, I added. My family has been operating under misconceptions about their financial situation and Ravenscroft's ownership. Before any decisions about the estate's future can be made, those misconceptions need to be corrected. Daniel reviewed the documents again, this time with a more strategic eye. This trust gives you significant leverage. Your father will not be pleased when he learns about it. I smiled slightly. I'm familiar with my father's reactions to having his plans disrupted. How would you like to proceed? Daniel asked, shifting into problem-solving mode. Would you prefer I inform your father about the trust directly, or would you like to address this with your family first? I had given this considerable thought. I believe it would be best coming from me in a family setting, with you present. In your capacity as the transfer attorney, your professional presence will help establish the legal reality of the situation and potentially moderate my parents' reactions. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. A reasonable approach. When would you like to have this meeting? As soon as possible. The longer we wait, the further along the transfer process goes, and the more embarrassing it becomes for everyone when it's halted. Daniel checked his calendar. I can make myself available tomorrow afternoon. Would you like me to arrange the meeting at your parents' home at Ravenscroft? Yes, I decided. Ravenscroft is the appropriate setting for this conversation. The estate itself was, after all, the heart of the matter. As Daniel made notes about the arrangement, I felt a curious sense of calm. After a decade of silent support and years of being undervalued by my family, I was finally taking control of the narrative. Whatever happened tomorrow afternoon would forever change my family dynamics, but the truth, however uncomfortable, was necessary for moving forward with integrity. I'll contact your father and suggest a family meeting regarding the Ravenscroft transfer, Daniel said, closing his notebook. I won't mention the trust specifically. That revelation should come from you. Thank you, I said, rising from my seat. I appreciate your professionalism in handling this sensitive situation. Daniel stood as well, extending his hand. I must say, Eleanor, this isn't how I expected our meeting to go. You've presented a potentially contentious situation with remarkable composure. I've had a good teacher in that regard, I replied, thinking of my grandmother. Margaret Ravenscroft believed that how we handle difficult truths reveals more about our character than how we celebrate easy victories. As I left Daniel's office and rode the elevator back to ground level, I felt a weight lifting. For the first time since learning about my parents' plans to transfer Ravenscroft, I wasn't simply reacting to events beyond my control. I had taken the initiative, choosing to reveal the truth on my own terms rather than allowing it to emerge in ways that might be even more damaging to my family. Tomorrow afternoon would bring confrontation, likely anger, possibly even temporary estrangement from my parents and brother, but it would also bring honesty, the first step toward whatever new relationship might be possible once the truth about Ravenscroft was acknowledged. As I stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow, with a strange mixture of apprehension and relief. The secret I had carried for a decade was about to be revealed, and whatever happened next, I would face it not as the overlooked daughter, but as the trustee my grandmother had believed I could, be poised, purposeful, and prepared to protect what mattered most. Saturday passed in a blur of anticipation. Daniel had confirmed our meeting at Ravenscroft for 2 Sunday afternoon, informing my parents that we needed to discuss important legal considerations regarding the property transfer. I spent the day at the museum in a state of hyper-focus, channeling my nervous energy into finalizing exhibition details with unusual efficiency. That evening, rather than returning directly to my apartment, I found myself driving toward Ravenscroft. With my family away for the night, my parents at a charity gala, Victor and Sophia at their downtown penthouse, I had a rare opportunity to experience the estate in solitude, to reconnect with the property I had preserved from afar. Mrs. Caldwell had long since left for the weekend, so I used my key to enter through the side door. The house greeted me with the particular silence that historic buildings possess, not emptiness, but the quiet presence of accumulated time. I moved through the darkened hallways without turning on lights, my feet automatically avoiding the creaking floorboard near the conservatory entrance, my hand trailing along the walnut paneling my great-grandfather had commissioned in 1902. In the library, the room Sophia planned to convert into an entertainment space, I finally switched, on a single lamp casting a warm circle of light over my grandmother's reading chair. The space appeared exactly as it had when I spent countless childhood afternoons here, discovering worlds between leather-bound covers, while Margaret Ravenscroft explained the difference between first editions and later printings, between hand-sewn bindings and machine-made. I pulled a volume from the shelf, Austen's Pride and Prejudice, an 1894 edition with gilt edges and marbled end papers. As I opened it, a folded note fell into my lap. I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. Eleanor. I watched you reading this today and saw myself at your age, discovering that strong women have always found ways to determine their own destinies, even within societal constraints. Keep this edition as your own. May you always recognize your worth, even when others fail to see it. Grandmother M. The date at the bottom showed I had been 15 when she wrote this, the same age I had stood up to my father for the first time, insisting on attending a preservation workshop at the local historical society instead of the debutante luncheon he had deemed more appropriate for a Ravenscroft daughter. I had forgotten about this note, this small testament to my grandmother's recognition of who I truly was, long before I fully understood myself. I returned the book to my portfolio, unwilling to leave this personal treasure to the uncertainties of tomorrow's revelation. Moving through the house, I catalogued countless details only a dedicated preservationist would notice. The restored crown molding in the drawing room, its intricate egg and dart pattern faithfully recreated from historical photographs. The period-appropriate hardware on the doors, sourced from specialty restoration suppliers in 3 different countries. The painstakingly matched historic paint colors that maintained the home's original aesthetic while accommodating modern materials. Each element represented not just financial investment, but hours of research, consultant meetings, and careful supervision, all conducted remotely, all funded through the trust, all invisible to my family who simply experienced Ravenscroft as a well-maintained historic home without understanding the deliberate effort required to keep it that way. In the East Wing, where Sophia planned her modest updates, I found myself mentally cataloging the architectural features that would be compromised or destroyed by her proposed renovations. The Palladian windows whose proportions would be disrupted, by her planned media room, the original heart pine flooring that would disappear beneath the home gym's rubber matting, the hand-painted Chinese wallpaper in the morning room that would be replaced by whatever contemporary style currently dominated design magazines. Yet as I continued through the house, my indignation gradually transformed into something more nuanced. Was I protecting Ravenscroft's historical integrity because of its genuine cultural significance, or because it represented the only domain where my expertise was unquestionably superior to Victor's? Was I resentful of my brother's plans because they threatened the property's heritage, or because they symbolized my family's persistent failure to recognize my value? These uncomfortable questions followed me into the West Gallery, where portraits of 5 generations of Ravenscrofts gazed down with patrician confidence. I paused before my grandmother's painting, completed when she was in her 60s, her expression conveying the perfect balance of authority and compassion that had defined her leadership of both family and community. "What would you have me do, grandmother?" I asked aloud, my voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. Reveal the truth and risk shattering the family? or find some compromise that preserves relationships alongside the property. Though no supernatural response came, the answer emerged from within my own understanding of Margaret Ravenscroft's values. She had created the trust not to drive wedges between family members, but to ensure that Ravenscroft's legacy continued under proper stewardship. Her letter had emphasized choice, compassion, and wisdom, not control, vindication, or power. From this perspective, tomorrow's revelation could be framed not as exposing my family's failures, but as offering a path forward that honored both heritage and relationship. The trust wasn't a weapon to wield against my family, but a tool for preserving what mattered most, not just architecturally, but emotionally and ethically as well. As I prepared to leave, I made a final stop in the estate office, a small room adjacent to the library where generations of Ravenscrofts had managed household affairs. In the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, I found what I was searching for: the original architectural plans for Ravenscroft, commissioned by Jonathan Ravenscroft in 1823, showing the classical proportions and deliberate sightlines that made the house architecturally significant. These plans represented something tangible I could share tomorrow, visual evidence of why certain aspects of Ravenscroft deserved preservation while others could accommodate modernization. By focusing on the property itself rather than the family, dynamics surrounding it, I might create space for constructive discussion rather than mere defensive reactions. I carefully placed the plans in my portfolio alongside the trust documentation and left Ravenscroft as quietly as I had entered, locking the side door behind me. The evening's exploration had shifted something fundamental in my approach to tomorrow's confrontation. Rather than steeling myself for battle, I was preparing for transformation, not just of my family's understanding of Ravenscroft's ownership, but of our relationships with each other and with the legacy we all shared in different ways. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, as if the universe itself approved of bringing hidden truths into the light. I spent the early hours reviewing the trust documentation once more, preparing concise explanations for the most likely questions, and organizing supporting materials in my portfolio. By noon, I felt as prepared as possible for what would inevitably be a challenging family encounter. Daniel called as I was preparing to leave for Ravenscroft. "I've spoken with your father," he reported. "He's expecting a routine meeting about transfer documentation, though he seemed slightly suspicious about why it required everyone's presence." "That's not surprising," I replied. "My father has built a career on detecting when others are withholding information." "I've prepared a brief overview of the trust's legal implications," Daniel continued, "to help clarify matters once you've made the initial disclosure. Do you still want to take the lead on this?" "Yes," I confirmed. "This needs to come from me, not from an outside legal representative, no matter how diplomatically presented." "Understood. I'll see you at Ravenscroft at 2. I arrived at the estate 30 minutes early, deliberately choosing to park my car in the main circular drive rather than my usual spot by the carriage house. This small assertion of belonging felt symbolic of the larger shifts about to occur in my family's perception of my role at Ravenscroft. Mrs. Caldwell greeted me with unusual formality. "Miss Eleanor, your parents are in the drawing room. They seem expectant." "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," I replied, wondering how much the perceptive housekeeper had deduced about today's meeting. "Would you mind bringing tea service in about 20 minutes? I think we'll all need it." "Of course, Miss Eleanor." She hesitated before adding, "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that some of us have always seen how much you care for Ravenscroft." This unexpected acknowledgement from someone who had witnessed our family dynamics for decades brought a sudden tightness to my throat. "Thank you," I managed. "That means a great deal." I found my parents exactly where Mrs. Caldwell had indicated, my father standing near the fireplace in his weekend casual attire, which for Charles Ravenscroft meant perfectly pressed khakis, and a cashmere sweater, rather than a formal suit. My mother sat nearby, elegant as always in a pale blue ensemble that complemented her silver hair. They both looked up with mild surprise at my early arrival. "Eleanor," my father acknowledged. "Daniel said this meeting was about finalizing transfer details. I didn't realize you'd be involved in the preliminary discussions." "There's been a change in the agenda," I replied, setting my portfolio on the coffee table but not yet opening it. "I'm actually the one who requested this meeting." My mother's brow furrowed slightly. "Is something wrong, dear? You look so serious." "Not wrong, exactly," I said carefully. "But there are aspects of the Ravenscroft situation that need to be addressed before any transfer can proceed." My father's expression sharpened with the analytical focus that had made him successful in banking. "What aspects?" Before I could respond, the doorbell announced Daniel's arrival. A moment later, Mrs. Caldwell showed him into the drawing room, followed closely by Victor and Sophia, who must have arrived simultaneously. "Perfect timing," I said, gesturing for everyone to take seats. "Now that we're all here, we can begin." Victor glanced between me and Daniel with confusion. "Begin what? I thought this was just about signing preliminary paperwork." "That was the original plan," Daniel confirmed, setting his briefcase beside my portfolio. "However, Eleanor has brought some information to my attention that significantly impacts the Ravenscroft transfer." All eyes turned to me with varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and in my father's case, growing suspicion. The moment had arrived. After a decade of silence, I was about to change my family's understanding of Ravenscroft, and of me, forever. I opened my portfolio and removed the trust documentation, its official seals and legal formatting immediately recognizable to my father's experienced eye. His posture stiffened visibly as I placed the documents on the coffee table. 15 years ago, I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Grandmother Margaret established a trust that holds legal title to Ravenscroft Manor. I have been the sole trustee of this trust since I turned 25. The property transfer you're planning cannot legally proceed because you don't actually own Ravenscroft. You haven't for 15 years. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence that followed my revelation seemed to stretch into eternity. My father stared at the trust documents, his banking experience allowing him to quickly grasp their implications. My mother's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of shock I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. Victor leaned forward, brow furrowed in confusion that rapidly transformed into disbelief. Sophia remained perfectly still, her interior designer's eye calculating the implications for her renovation plans. "This is impossible," my father finally said, voice dangerously quiet. "Mother would never have done something like this without informing me." "She did inform someone," I replied steadily. "Harriet Winters handled all the legal arrangements. The trust was intentionally kept confidential until circumstances necessitated its disclosure." Daniel cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the documentation thoroughly, Mr. Ravenscroft. The Margaret Ravenscroft Historical Preservation Trust is the legal owner of Ravenscroft Manor. The property was transferred from your parents' names to the trust 15 years ago, with Eleanor named as trustee once she reached 25. My father's face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous. Some kind of mistake or misunderstanding." "There's no mistake," I said, pushing the financial records toward him. "For the past 10 years, I've been paying the mortgage on Ravenscroft, covering property taxes, funding, maintenance and restoration work, all through the trust, which is why you never knew." My mother gasped. "You've been paying the mortgage? But how? Why?" "Because grandmother knew the estate was financially vulnerable," I explained, keeping my voice level. "She understood that you and Dad were struggling to maintain it even 15 years ago, and she foresaw that those challenges would only increase." Victor grabbed the financial records, scanning them with increasing disbelief. This shows hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments over the years. Where did you get this kind of money? I lived modestly. I invested carefully. I prioritized Ravenscroft over personal luxuries, I said simply. Everything I couldn't cover from my salary, I supplemented with the investment portfolio grandmother left in the trust. My father had begun paging through the trust document, his legal training allowing him to quickly grasp its implications. His expression shifted from disbelief to cold fury. So, you've been secretly controlling Ravenscroft, while letting us believe it was still ours, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, playing us for fools all these years. That's not how I see it, I countered. I've been preserving our family legacy while respecting grandmother's wishes for confidentiality. The trust specified that its existence should remain private unless circumstances required disclosure. Circumstances like us giving the property to Victor, my mother concluded, her voice small. Precisely, Daniel confirmed. Attempting to transfer property you don't legally own necessitated revealing the trust's existence. Victor slammed the financial records onto the table. This is absurd. Dad, there must be some way to challenge this. She can't just swoop in and claim Ravenscroft is hers after we've made plans to take over the estate. It's not about claiming ownership, I corrected him. It's about acknowledging the legal reality that has existed for 15 years. Ravenscroft is held in trust, with me as the trustee responsible for ensuring its preservation. My father turned to Daniel, professional mask dropping to reveal raw anger. You're my attorney. Fix this. Daniel maintained his composure admirably. Mr. Ravenscroft, I'm handling the Ravenscroft transfer on behalf of the firm, but in this situation, I have an ethical obligation to recognize legitimate legal instruments. This trust is valid and binding. You cannot transfer property you don't own. So what happens now? My mother asked, looking between Daniel and me. Does this mean Victor and Sophia can't live at Ravenscroft after all? It was the question I had anticipated, the one that would allow me to shift from revelation to resolution. That depends, I said carefully. The trust gives me authority to determine Ravenscroft's future, but I'm not opposed to Victor and his family living here under certain conditions. Victor laughed bitterly. Conditions? You're going to dictate terms to us about our family home? Our family home, I emphasized. Not yours exclusively. Ravenscroft belongs to the Harrington legacy, which I've been quietly protecting for a decade while you've been building your banking career and planning renovations for property you don't own. What conditions? My father asked, legal mind already calculating potential compromises. I took a deep breath. This was the moment to articulate what I truly wanted, not just for Ravenscroft, but for our family's relationship moving forward. First, acknowledgement of the trust's existence and my role as trustee. No legal challenges or attempts to undermine grandmother's wishes, I began. Second, establishment of a family council to make major decisions about Ravenscroft's maintenance and preservation, with my vote carrying final authority as specified in the trust. I paused, gauging their reactions. My father's expression remained stony, but he was listening. Victor looked mutinous, but contained. My mother simply appeared overwhelmed. Third, I continued, financial transparency. If Victor and Sophia wish to live at Ravenscroft, they must contribute substantially to its upkeep. No more free riding on my contributions while spending lavishly on luxury cars and vacations. How dare you? Victor began, but my father raised a hand to silence him. Continue, Eleanor, he said tersely. Finally, respect for Ravenscroft's historical character. Any renovations or changes must be approved by the family council, with priority given to preserving the estate's architectural integrity and historical significance. My father regarded me with a new calculating expression. And if we agree to these terms, then Victor and Sophia can make Ravenscroft their primary residence? Yes, I said, The trust allows for family occupation of the property while maintaining its protected status. I have no desire to exclude anyone from Ravenscroft. I simply want to ensure it receives the care and respect it deserves. And if we refuse? Victor challenged. I met his gaze steadily. Then I'll exercise my authority as trustee to convert Ravenscroft into a historical foundation with limited family access. Grandmother included that option in the trust as a last resort if family cooperation proved impossible. The threat hung in the air, potent but not aggressive. I wasn't seeking to punish them, only to protect what mattered. Daniel stepped in diplomatically. Perhaps everyone needs time to process this information before making decisions. The transfer cannot proceed as planned, but there's clearly room for a family arrangement that respects both the trust's legal requirements and everyone's connection to Ravenscroft. My father stood abruptly. I need to speak with Harriet Winters. If this trust truly exists as described, she has a lot of explaining to do about keeping it secret all these years. Harriet was following grandmother's explicit instructions, I reminded him. Her professional obligation was to her client, grandmother, not to you. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. Victor, we need to discuss this privately. Daniel, I expect a full briefing on our legal options tomorrow morning. Daniel nodded but added carefully, I'll prepare an analysis, Mr. Ravenscroft, but I should note that the trust appears legally sound. Your options may be limited to working within its parameters rather than challenging its validity. As my father and Victor prepared to leave the room, my mother approached me, her expression a complex mixture of hurt and bewilderment. All these years, she said quietly, you've been carrying this responsibility alone. Why didn't you tell us you were paying for Ravenscroft? The simple question pierced through my carefully maintained composure. Would you have believed me if I had? Would you have acknowledged what that contribution meant, or would it have been dismissed as just Eleanor being dramatic, as so many of my concerns have been throughout my life? My mother flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. We've underestimated you, she admitted softly. I've underestimated you. It was a small acknowledgement, but more than I had expected from this initial confrontation. As my parents and Victor left to continue their discussion elsewhere in the house, Sophia remained behind, studying me with newfound calculation. You've been paying for the roof over our heads at the Sunday dinners where your father criticized your career choices, she said, not as an accusation but as a clarification of facts. Yes. And the library restoration last year that Victor complained was an unnecessary expense? Yes. And the new heating system that keeps the East Wing comfortable, the wing we're planning to renovate? Yes. She nodded slowly, absorbing these revelations with the practical assessment I'd always respected in her, despite our differences. This changes the dynamic considerably. It should, I acknowledged. Sophia crossed the room to the architectural plans I'd deliberately left visible on the side table. These are the original Ravenscroft blueprints? From 1823. Jonathan Ravenscroft commissioned them from William Harrison, who studied under Sir John Soane in London. She examined them with professional interest. The proportional relationships are remarkable. Classical golden ratio throughout. Exactly what makes the library space so architecturally significant, I noted. Converting it to an entertainment room would destroy those proportions. Instead of becoming defensive, Sophia surprised me by nodding thoughtfully. I can see that now. The entertainment space could be redesigned for the old billiards room without compromising historical elements. She looked up from the plans. You have expertise I didn't acknowledge. This practical recognition of my professional knowledge, something my family had consistently devalued, was unexpected and genuinely appreciated. And you have design talent that could enhance Ravenscroft while respecting its heritage, I offered, in return. Sophia studied me with newfound respect. Victor won't adapt easily to this new reality. He's been raised to expect Ravenscroft as his birthright. I know, but expectations based on misunderstandings eventually collide with reality. Indeed, she agreed. For what it's worth, I think your conditions are reasonable, though Victor will need time to see that. She gathered her purse, preparing to join my brother and parents. This isn't how any of us expected this Sunday to unfold. No, I acknowledged, but sometimes necessary revelations arrive on their own timeline. As Sophia left the room, Daniel gathered his materials, his legal mind visibly processing the family dynamics he had just witnessed. You handled that remarkably well, he observed. Many people would have used this revelation as an opportunity for revenge rather than resolution. Revenge has never been my goal, I replied, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline was fading. I just want truth and recognition for myself and for what Ravenscroft represents. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, I think you've achieved both today. The path forward won't be easy, but you've created the possibility for something better than what existed before. As Daniel gathered his documents, Mrs. Caldwell entered with the tea service I had requested earlier, timing that suggested she might have been waiting for the initial confrontation to conclude. "Shall I leave this, Miss Eleanor?" she asked, setting the silver tray on the side table. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," I replied, noting the second cup she had deliberately included. "And if you wouldn't mind telling whoever is listening in the hallway that they're welcome to join me rather than eavesdropping." A moment later, as Daniel departed with promises to follow up tomorrow, the door reopened to admit Harriet Winters, her arrival perfectly timed as always. "I thought you might need reinforcement," she said simply, taking the chair opposite mine. "How did they take it?" "About as expected," I replied, pouring tea for both of us. Shock, anger, disbelief, the standard stages of confronting unwelcome truth. "And you?" I considered the question carefully, relieved that it's finally in the open, exhausted by the emotional toll, but primarily hopeful. Hopeful. Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Sophia surprised me," I explained. She approached the revelation with practical assessment rather than emotional reaction. She acknowledged my expertise and immediately began adapting her plans to accommodate the new reality. "An unexpected ally," Harriet observed, stirring honey into her tea. "Perhaps, at minimum, someone who might help Victor adjust to the new arrangement once he moves past his initial anger." Harriet nodded approvingly. "Building alliances will be crucial in the days ahead. Your family will look for weaknesses in your position, not just legally, but emotionally. Having someone inside their discussions who understands your perspective could prove invaluable." "I hadn't thought of it that way," I admitted. "I've been so focused on preparing for confrontation that I hadn't considered the importance of coalition building." "Margaret understood this principle well," Harriet remarked. "She maintained relationships across competing interests throughout her life. It's how she protected Ravenscroft through multiple financial challenges before establishing the trust." This insight into my grandmother's approach resonated deeply. My revelation today wasn't the end of the process, but merely the beginning of a new phase in Ravenscroft's stewardship, one that would require not just legal authority, but relationship skills I had often neglected while focusing on the property itself. "What would you suggest as my next step?" I asked Harriet, valuing her strategic thinking and decades of experience navigating family dynamics. "Give them space to process today's revelation," she advised. "Then approach each family member individually before any group discussion resumes. Your father will respond to legal and financial realities, your mother to emotional and relationship concerns, Victor to practical questions about his future at Ravenscroft. And Sophia?" "Already moving toward alliance," Harriet observed. "Nurture that connection. Her practical nature makes her a natural bridge between competing perspectives." As we finished our tea, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The truth about Ravenscroft was finally in the open, creating possibility for authentic relationship in place of the illusions and assumptions that had defined our family interactions for years. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, it would be based on reality rather than misconception. Grandmother would be pleased, I said softly, glancing at her portrait above the fireplace. Margaret was many things, but never naive about human nature, Harriet agreed. She knew this day would come eventually. She trusted you to handle it with the wisdom she saw in you long before you recognized it yourself. As Harriet departed, I remained in the drawing room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my decade of stewardship, the restored moldings, the preserved artwork, the carefully maintained furnishings that connected present to past. Whatever happened next, Ravenscroft would continue under truthful stewardship rather than financial illusion, and my role in its preservation would finally be acknowledged, for better or worse, by the family that had overlooked my contributions for far too long. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected sense of liberation. For the first time in a decade, I walked into my office at the Westbrook Museum without carrying the weight of Ravenscroft's secret. Whatever happened next would unfold in the light of truth rather than shadow. My assistant Marcus noticed the change immediately. "Something's different," he observed, setting my usual morning coffee on my desk. "You seem lighter somehow." "Family matters finally coming to resolution," I replied, not quite ready to share the full story. Sometimes facing difficult truths is more liberating than avoiding them. "Cryptic, but intriguing," he said with a smile before returning to his desk. I had barely begun reviewing the day's correspondence when my phone rang. Daniel Green calling with an update. "Your father contacted Harriet Winters last night," he reported without preamble. "They had a lengthy meeting that apparently confirmed everything in the trust documentation." "How did he take it?" I asked, though I could well imagine my father's reaction to having his authority comprehensively circumvented by his own mother. "Professionally outraged but legally resigned," Daniel replied. "Harriet made it clear that challenging the trust would be both expensive and ultimately futile. Your grandmother's documentation is impeccable." "So what's his approach now?" "He's requested a formal family meeting this Wednesday evening at Ravenscroft to discuss, and I quote, reasonable accommodations within the parameters of the trust. He's asked me to attend as an independent legal observer." This was more constructive than I had anticipated. My father was nothing if not pragmatic when faced with immovable legal realities. Once he accepted that the trust couldn't be overturned, he would inevitably shift to negotiating the best possible terms within its constraints. "Wednesday works for me," I confirmed. "Will Harriet be there?" "Your father specifically requested her presence as the trust's legal representative." After ending the call with Daniel, I phoned Harriet to gauge her perspective on this development. "Charles spent 2 hours reviewing every aspect of the trust documentation," she reported, referring to my father by his first name as she had throughout my life. "He was particularly interested in the financial records of your contributions over the past decade." "That doesn't surprise me," I said. "Dad always respects financial commitment, even when he disagrees with the underlying principles." "Precisely. I believe seeing the extent of your investment in Ravenscroft's preservation made a significant impression. He mentioned several times that he had underestimated Eleanor's commitment." This glimpse into my father's private reaction was illuminating. In our family's value system, financial commitment represented seriousness of purpose in a way emotional or philosophical arguments never could. My decade of material investment in Ravenscroft spoke a language my father understood implicitly. "What's your assessment of Wednesday's meeting? Should I prepare for continued resistance or potential compromise?" "Both," Harriet advised. "Charles is too proud to surrender, completely, but too practical to fight a losing battle. Expect challenging questions about your long-term plans for Ravenscroft, financial projections for its maintenance, and specific conditions for Victor and Sophia's potential residency. So, I should come with comprehensive documentation. Absolutely. Treat this like a professional presentation, not a family discussion. Your father respects thorough preparation above all else. With this guidance in mind, I cleared my schedule for the next 2 days, delegating museum responsibilities to focus entirely on preparing for Wednesday's meeting. This would require not just legal documentation, but a comprehensive vision for Ravenscroft's future that could potentially unite our family around shared purpose rather than continued division. I began by contacting Dr. Abigail Montgomery, the region's preeminent architectural historian who had assisted with Ravenscroft's National Registry application 5 years earlier. She agreed to provide an updated assessment of the property's historical significance, emphasizing which elements required absolute preservation versus areas where thoughtful modernization could occur without compromising integrity. Next, I reached out to Martin Blackwood at the Historical Preservation Society, who had long encouraged me to consider establishing Ravenscroft as a limited-access historical site. While I wasn't ready to commit to that approach, his expertise in financial models for historic estates would prove invaluable in demonstrating sustainable paths forward. By Tuesday afternoon, my apartment had transformed into a strategy center, with preservation reports, financial projections, and architectural analyses spread across every surface. I was reviewing restoration priorities when my phone rang with a number I didn't immediately recognize. Eleanor Ravenscroft speaking. It's Sophia. My brother's wife's distinctive voice carried none of its usual polished confidence. Do you have time to meet today? Just the two of us? This unexpected outreach aligned perfectly with Harriet's advice about building individual relationships before the family gathering. Of course. What did you have in mind? Could you come to our penthouse around 6? Victor has a dinner meeting downtown. We could speak privately. The invitation to their downtown luxury residence rather than a neutral location suggested Sophia was offering unprecedented access to her personal space, a significant gesture in our family's subtle power dynamics. I'll be there, I confirmed, curious about what had prompted this initiative from the family member I knew least well. The Chapman residences where Victor and Sophia lived embodied exactly the sleek, contemporary luxury that contrasted so sharply with Ravenscroft's historical gravitas. The doorman announced my arrival with practiced deference, and Sophia herself met me at the elevator on the penthouse floor. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading me into an expansive living area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The space was impeccably designed in understated grays and whites, with carefully curated art pieces that revealed Sophia's genuine aesthetic sophistication beneath her sometimes superficial presentation. "Your home is beautiful," I offered sincerely, recognizing the thoughtful design elements that spoke to her professional training. "Thank you," she acknowledged, gesturing me toward a seating area far removed from the entry, ensuring our conversation wouldn't be overheard if Victor returned unexpectedly. "Can I offer you something to drink? Wine? Tea?" "Tea would be lovely." As Sophia prepared our drinks in the open kitchen, I observed how differently she moved in this space compared to Ravenscroft. Here, among her own design choices, she displayed a natural confidence that Ravenscroft's historical gravitas seemed to suppress. "I'll be direct," she said, returning with a modern tea service that contrasted sharply with Ravenscroft's silver antiques. "Sunday's revelation has created significant tension between Victor and your father." This was unexpected. I assumed they'd be unified in their opposition to the trust. "Quite the opposite," Sophia replied, her expression thoughtful as she poured the tea. "Your father blames Victor for accelerating the property transfer without sufficient legal investigation. Victor blames your father for never disclosing Ravenscroft's financial vulnerabilities. They're turning on each other rather than focusing on you." The observation was astute and revealed dynamics I hadn't anticipated. And where do you stand in all this? Sophia considered her response carefully. I'm finding myself in a uniquely independent position. Neither my career nor my identity is tied to Ravenscroft the way it is for the rest of you. I can see possibilities where others see only threats. What possibilities do you see? Potential collaboration rather than competition. Your preservation? Expertise combined with my interior design background. Your historical knowledge with Victor's financial acumen. If we approached Ravenscroft as complementary partners rather than competing interests, we might create something extraordinary. The proposal was so unexpected, yet so aligned with my deeper hopes that for a moment I couldn't respond. Sophia had articulated precisely the cooperative vision I had barely dared imagine. That's remarkably similar to what I've been considering, I admitted. But I didn't think anyone else would see it that way. Sophia's smile held surprising warmth. Yesterday I pulled every book on historical preservation from my design library. I've spent 24 hours learning about adaptive reuse, historical integrity, and preservation tax credits. Your approach makes sense professionally, not just sentimentally. She rose and retrieved a portfolio from her desk, returning to spread architectural drawings across the coffee table. These are my initial concepts for the East Wing, reimagined with respect for historical elements while creating functional modern living spaces. I examined the drawings with growing appreciation. Where her previous plans had imposed contemporary design regardless of historical context, these new concepts worked thoughtfully within the existing architectural framework, enhancing rather than erasing historical elements. These are extraordinary, Sophia. You've maintained all the significant architectural details while creating genuinely livable spaces. It's a better design challenge, she acknowledged. Working with historical constraints pushes creativity further than simply imposing contemporary aesthetics. As we discussed specific design elements, a deeper understanding emerged between us. Sophia wasn't merely making tactical alliance. She was discovering genuine professional interest in historical design principles I had assumed she dismissed. Why are you showing me this? I finally asked. You could have waited for Wednesday's meeting. Sophia set down her teacup deliberately. Because tomorrow night will be unnecessarily adversarial if we don't establish some preliminary understanding. Victor and your father will approach this as a negotiation to be won, rather than a collaboration to be developed. And you're suggesting we present a united perspective? I'm suggesting we demonstrate what's possible when preservation and innovation work together, rather than in opposition. She hesitated before adding, I've also arranged for representatives from the Architectural Heritage Foundation to attend tomorrow's meeting. This was a bold move that simultaneously supported my preservation priorities while providing independent verification of Ravenscroft's significance beyond family sentiment. That's surprisingly helpful, I acknowledged. May I ask what prompted this initiative? Sophia's expression turned reflective. When I saw those financial records, the sacrifices you've made while we lived extravagantly, it challenged everything I thought I understood about your family dynamics. It made me question what other assumptions might be incorrect. This honest self-reflection represented the kind of growth I hadn't expected from any family member, let alone Sophia. There's something else you should know, she continued. After reviewing the trust documentation, your father has been meeting with financial advisors. Ravenscroft requires approximately $175,000 annually for proper maintenance and preservation. He's proposing to establish a family foundation that would generate sustainable funding without requiring your personal contributions. This development was genuinely surprising. He's actually acknowledging the financial requirements? More than acknowledging, he's developing a sustainable solution. I believe he's trying to demonstrate that he can still contribute meaningfully to Ravenscroft's preservation even without legal ownership. This insight into my father's thinking transformed my expectations for tomorrow's meeting. Rather than preparing for continued resistance, I needed to prepare for unexpected collaboration on terms I hadn't anticipated. "Thank you for sharing this," I said sincerely. "You've given me crucial perspective for tomorrow's discussion." As I prepared to leave, Sophia handed me a flash drive. These contain my complete design concepts, along with documentation from 3 historical renovation specialists willing to consult on Ravenscroft's modernization. I thought you might want to review them before tomorrow. The gesture represented more than practical preparation. It signified Sophia's recognition of my authority and expertise regarding Ravenscroft, a significant shift from her previous dismissive attitude. "One last question," I asked as we reached the door. "Does Victor know about your revised approach?" "Not yet," she admitted. "He's still processing the shock of Sunday's revelation, but he respects my design judgment, even when he disagrees with my conclusions. If I present this as the optimal professional solution rather than concession to your authority, he'll listen." As I drove home through the evening traffic, I found myself reevaluating everything I had assumed about tomorrow's meeting. Instead of preparing for battle, I needed to prepare for unexpected alliances and collaborative possibilities I hadn't dared anticipate. When I reached my apartment, I immediately called Harriet to update her on these developments. "It seems we may find allies where we least expected them," I concluded after summarizing my conversation with Sophia. "Margaret would be pleased," Harriet observed. "She always believed that given appropriate information, people could transcend self-interest to serve shared purpose. Perhaps her faith in your family's better nature wasn't misplaced after all." As I spent the evening reviewing Sophia's designs and incorporating them into my presentation for tomorrow, I felt a growing sense of possibility. What had begun as confrontation might transform into collaboration. What had started as painful revelation might evolve into family renewal based on truth rather than illusion. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would enter the meeting not only with legal authority and financial documentation, but with unexpected allies and collaborative proposals that might bridge divides I had long considered unbridgeable. The path forward was becoming clearer, not without challenges, but with genuine possibility for resolution that honored both Ravenscroft's legacy and our family's future. Wednesday arrived with the crystalline clarity that often follows major life decisions. After reviewing all my documentation one final time, I arrived at the Westbrook Museum earlier than usual to finalize my presentation materials for the evening's meeting. The museum's conservation lab provided the perfect environment for organizing the historical assessments, financial projections, and architectural analyses that would form the foundation of my proposal. Dr. Montgomery had delivered her comprehensive assessment of Ravenscroft's historical significance late the previous evening, a meticulous room-by-room evaluation identifying critical preservation priorities versus areas where thoughtful modernization could occur. Martin Blackwood's financial sustainability models provided multiple pathways for maintaining Ravenscroft's integrity while accommodating family use. Combined with Sophia's innovative design concepts, these resources created a compelling vision for Ravenscroft's future that respected both its historical significance and its role as a family legacy. As I organized these materials, my office door opened to admit Marcus, carrying not just my usual morning coffee but a small wrapped package. "Special delivery," he announced, placing both on my desk. "Courier brought this moments ago. Signature required, so it must be important." The package bore Harriet's law firm's embossed logo. Inside, I discovered a small leather-bound volume with a note in Harriet's distinctive handwriting. "Eleanor, this belonged to your grandmother. She requested I give it to you when Eleanor finally claims her rightful place at Ravenscroft. I believe today qualifies. With confidence, Harriet." The book was Margaret Ravenscroft's personal journal from 1972, the year she had successfully prevented Ravenscroft's surrounding lands from being sold for commercial development, despite my grandfather's financial pressures to liquidate the assets. It represented her first major battle for Ravenscroft's preservation, long before establishing the trust that would eventually secure its future. Opening it to a marked page, I found an entry that seemed written specifically for this moment. June 18, 1972. The board voted today to designate Ravenscroft's eastern acreage as protected wetlands, effectively preventing Edward's development plans. He is furious with me, seeing only the immediate financial loss rather than the long-term preservation of Ravenscroft's environmental integrity. When protecting something of genuine value, one must be prepared to be momentarily misunderstood by those focused on immediate gain rather than lasting legacy. The hardest battles are rarely between good and evil, but between short-term benefit and long-term stewardship. These conflicts require not just courage, but patience, compassion for opposing perspectives, and unwavering commitment to the deeper purpose beneath surface disagreements. I do not fight Edward. I fight for Ravenscroft, for future generations who will walk these grounds and find connection to something larger than themselves. May they forgive our short-sighted impulses and honor our better intentions. My grandmother's words, written nearly 50 years earlier, spoke directly to my current situation with uncanny precision. Her perspective reinforced my approach to the evening's meeting, focusing not on winning a family conflict, but on securing Ravenscroft's long-term prosperity and preservation. The day passed with unexpected swiftness as I finalized preparations, while maintaining my museum responsibilities. At 4:30, I left the Westbrook, stopping briefly at my apartment to change into a navy suit that projected professional authority while honoring the Ravenscroft tradition of understated elegance. Before departing for the estate, I received an unexpected text from Daniel Green. Fascinating developments. Your father has requested financial advisors attend tonight's meeting. Arriving early to review their proposals. Positive indicator. This further confirmed Sophia's insight about my father's constructive approach, reinforcing my decision to prepare for collaboration rather than confrontation. I gathered my materials, including my grandmother's journal, and drove toward Ravenscroft with determined optimism. The evening sky glowed with spectacular sunset colors as I approached the estate, nature itself seeming to acknowledge the significance of the moment. Rather than my usual side entrance, I deliberately parked beside Harriet's car in the main circular drive, claiming my rightful place as Ravenscroft's trustee. Mrs. Caldwell greeted me at the door with quiet dignity. "They're gathered in the library, Miss Eleanor. Mr. Winters arrived 10 minutes ago with the financial advisors. Miss Sophia and Mr. Victor just arrived. Your parents are with Mr. Green in your father's study, reviewing documents." "Thank you. Mrs. Caldwell, would you mind arranging coffee service in about 30 minutes? I suspect we'll need it." "Already prepared, Miss Eleanor. And I've taken the liberty of setting out the Ravenscroft historical documents in the library display case, the ones you had preserved last year. I thought they might provide helpful context for tonight's discussions." This thoughtful initiative revealed Mrs. Caldwell's subtle support. As the person who had maintained Ravenscroft's daily operations for decades, her perspective carried significant moral authority within the household, even if rarely acknowledged. Perfect. Thank you. I made my way to the library, pausing briefly to center myself before entering. This room, with its Lutyens-designed bookcases, original wood paneling, and centuries of Ravenscroft's collected knowledge, had always represented the heart of the estate's historical significance. It was fitting that our family's future would be determined here, surrounded by tangible reminders of our legacy. Inside, I found an unexpected scene. Rather than adversarial positioning, the room had been arranged for collaborative discussion. The massive oak table that normally occupied the center had been supplemented with additional seating arranged in a conference format, Professional presentation equipment had been set up at one end, while refreshments waited discreetly on the side credenza. Harriet stood in conversation with Martin Blackwood and two individuals I recognized as senior partners from Brunswick Financial Advisors, my father's longtime financial consultants. Dr. Montgomery was examining the architectural drawings displayed on easels along one wall, while Sophia discussed specific details with a distinguished gentleman I didn't immediately recognize. Victor stood slightly apart, reviewing documents with uncharacteristic focus. He glanced up as I entered, his expression guarded but not overtly hostile. "Eleanor," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Quite the gathering you've assembled." "Not just my doing," I corrected gently. "Sophia's initiative with the architectural specialists, Dad's engagement with the financial advisors. This appears to be a collective effort." A flash of surprise crossed his features. "You knew about Dad's financial team?" Sophia mentioned he was exploring sustainable funding options. It's a constructive approach. Before Victor could respond, my father and mother entered with Daniel Green. My father carried a leather portfolio similar to mine, his posture conveying the focused intensity he brought to significant business matters. My mother followed with quiet dignity, her expression revealing both apprehension and determination. "Eleanor," my father began formally, "I see everyone has arrived. Shall we begin?" His deference to my authority, however reluctant, represented a significant shift from Sunday's angry dismissal. Rather than challenging my position, he was acknowledging my right to lead this discussion, even as he prepared to present his own proposals. "Thank you all for coming," I addressed the assembled group, moving to the position at the head of the table that had traditionally been my father's. Before we begin formal presentations, I'd like to clarify the purpose of tonight's meeting. All eyes focused on me with varying degrees of curiosity, assessment, and in Dr. Montgomery's case, professional approval. We're gathered to determine Ravenscroft's future governance and preservation within the parameters established by my grandmother's trust. This isn't merely a legal discussion, but a family conversation about shared values, responsibilities, and vision. I opened my portfolio and removed my grandmother's journal, placing it deliberately on the table. Earlier today, I received this, Margaret Ravenscroft's personal journal from 1972, when she fought her first major battle for Ravenscroft's preservation. Her perspective reinforces what I believe should guide our discussion. Focus on Ravenscroft's long-term welfare rather than short-term interests or personal authority. My father's expression shifted with genuine interest. "Mother's journal? I wasn't aware it had been preserved." "Harriet has maintained it in safekeeping," I explained, "as she did the trust documentation, awaiting the appropriate moment for its revelation." I turned to address the entire group. "I propose we structure tonight's discussion in 3 parts. First, establishing shared understanding of Ravenscroft's historical and architectural significance. Second, addressing financial requirements for its sustainable preservation. Third, developing a governance structure that respects both the trust's legal parameters and our family's continued connection to the estate." No one objected to this framework, allowing me to continue with growing confidence. "Dr. Montgomery, would you begin by presenting your assessment of Ravenscroft's historical significance?" For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Montgomery detailed Ravenscroft's architectural importance with scholarly precision and practical clarity. Using photographs, historical documents, and architectural analysis, she identified the elements that made Ravenscroft culturally significant beyond our family's personal attachment. Its rare Georgian federal transitional architecture, the documented connection to prominent early American craftsmen, and its exceptional state of preservation compared to similar estates of its period. "What's particularly remarkable about Ravenscroft," she concluded, "is not just its historical features, but the exceptional maintenance of those elements. unlike many historic properties that have suffered degradation through neglect or inappropriate modernization. Ravenscroft has been preserved with extraordinary attention to authentic detail. My mother spoke unexpectedly. We have Eleanor to thank for that attention to detail. Long before the trust revelation, she was the one who researched appropriate restoration methods, identified period-appropriate materials, and insisted on historical accuracy when everyone else prioritized convenience. This acknowledgement of my long-standing commitment to Ravenscroft's preservation, coming from my mother rather than an outside expert, carried particular emotional weight. My father nodded in reluctant agreement, while Victor studied me with what appeared to be dawning recognition. Which brings us to the financial requirements for maintaining this level of historical integrity. I transitioned smoothly. Martin Blackwood from the Historical Preservation Society has prepared a comprehensive analysis of Ravenscroft's maintenance requirements and potential funding models. Martin's presentation provided detailed financial projections that confirmed what I had been silently addressing for years. Ravenscroft required approximately $175,000 annually for basic maintenance, with additional funds needed for ongoing restoration projects and emergency repairs. His matter-of-fact presentation transformed what had been my private burden into objective reality that everyone present could understand and evaluate. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.